Much, Nelly. All right, we got this going. So welcome everyone. It is so nice to be here. I was telling Nelly before I haven't done a chapter chat since my last book, I think, and so holding space for all these people being recorded is really exciting tonight. So we are here together for about an hour, maybe a little less, to talk about trauma-informed spaces of liberation. And before we even begin, I just want to kind of get us grounded in some intention. A lot of you are here from across the country. Some of you are New York centric. Some of you are elsewhere, West Coast, Middle America, all over the place. And so, I just want us to be have intention about why we joined tonight and really live in this space. I'm sure a lot of you have a lot going on. There's a lot going on in the world. So I just want to name that. And I'm going to start off just to kind of tell you what we're going to do tonight is I'm going to start off by my introduction. Some of you may have heard my introductions before, but it's really important for me to share who I am so you get a sense of who I am without making assumptions before we begin. And then I'm going to talk about a little about why I decided to write this book that will be out in the fall, most likely. And we will get started there. I do have a PowerPoint, and for those of you that have sat in spaces with me before, I'm not just a PowerPoint person, so I'll probably put it up. I'm going to do some self-reflective questions. And so I really want you to walk away tonight with something. We don't know what that something is yet, but hopefully it's something that will shift your practice and shift your mindset just a little bit. So as Nelly introduced me, I am Laura Quiros. My pronouns are she, her. I am calling in from Montclair, New Jersey, which is on the land of the Lenape. I identify as a Black Latina who's also Jewish. My dad is Puerto Rican Venezuelan, and my mom, who passed away about 2 years ago, was Jewish and white from Poland. Her family was from, and Russia. And so I occupy many different intersectional identities. I am also a mother of a 16-year-old and a 10-year-old. And so I am here with you tonight in all of those many intersectional identities. I am an associate professor of social work at Montclair State University, where I started about 2 years ago. And prior to that, I was at Adelphi University for about 13 years as a faculty member, as associate dean. And in addition to that, I also have a pretty thriving consulting practice where I work with organizations, non-for-profit, law firms, executive coaching, on the sincere integration of trauma-informed social justice is what I call. And that was really what my first book was about. Nelly can put, not now or maybe now, whenever, my website in the chat. There's a ton of information on that website, from articles to videos, just to give you a little idea about who I am and what I do. I start from an intentional place of introduction because I feel that that is really important, whether I am sitting in space with you tonight, a virtual space, whether I am in front of my students in my classroom, whether I am training or dialoguing or with my community, because it's really important for you to get to know who I am, and also for you and your clients and your students, for those of you that are instructors, to get to know who you are. And I think traditionally social work has taught us to kind of remove our use of self. And one of my kind of positive disruptions to the field is that we use our sense of self, that we name our identity, that we name our positionality, that we name the many different places that we come from in order to deepen that therapeutic alliance. And so I'm going to tell a little, I guess, story about why I decided to write this book that is still in process. And I have actually two of my students from Montclair State, international students, that are writing 2 chapters in the book. So as I think you know, I've said before, and those of you that have held space with me before, I live in the space of trauma-informed social justice. That's my lens. It's not only my lens for my professional spaces, but it's my lens for my personal spaces too. And growing up as a multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious child, I had to negotiate many spaces of racism, many spaces of anti-Semitism, as well as growing up in a home that was filled with a lot of interpersonal, socio-political, and intergenerational trauma. And so from the age of 6, which was my first loss of a sibling that I had, I entered that world through that 6-year-old, through the space of trauma. And so, long story short, I decided to sort of ground myself and my work around trauma. So in that work, I started off in a traditional substance abuse treatment center, and way back then it was called the therapeutic community, and we'd work with women, mostly women of color, who had histories of substance abuse. And I happened to be trained by Lisa Najavitz, who wrote the Seeking Safety curriculum, and we learned through our research that 99.9% of clients who have experienced substance abuse have histories of trauma. And so while we can sit in these safe spaces, these safe and brave spaces of group work and individual work, once the client leaves our safe, brave surroundings, they enter the environment. And not only do they enter the environment, but they are taking their interpersonal, their socio-political, and their intergenerational traumas with them. And I realized through my work that those environments were re-traumatizing to my clients. And I also realized that the trauma world was very grounded in a white male cisgendered space. I am not that. And so a lot of my work was around disrupting the trauma space, from the place of a woman of color, from the place of somebody that grew up in these intersectional identities with these intersectional experiences. And so that was the work that I was doing in organizations, in my academic institution, in my community. And I realized after some time that I am surrounded by all of this trauma. And I started to do some work on post-traumatic growth, right? And understanding that through trauma, we often have an opportunity to grow. We often have an opportunity to go deeper, to realize things that we may not have realized before. So in the treatment world, there's this phrase that relapse is part of recovery, that the relapse that the client has literally and figuratively is the opportunity for us to see what we need to do better, what we need to do different. And so I started to think about this opportunity in trauma, and I especially started to think about this opportunity in trauma during the COVID-19 pandemic, in isolation, surrounded by my kids, homeschooling, a lot of pain in the world, a lot of racial injustice that was not new, but experienced in different ways. And I thought to myself, I can't live in all of this deficit framework. I can't live in all of this trauma. It's literally, eating up my soul and not making for a place of joy. And so I started to really think about the word joy. And I started to think about, how do I, as a social worker, as an educator, as a mother, as a friend, as a partner, start to bring joy intentionally into my life? And I started to think about that in the field of social work, in my many years of education and my many years of experience, no one ever really taught me about joy. No one ever told me how to engage my clients around joy. I know how to engage them around pain. I know how to engage them around struggle. I know how to engage them around systems of oppression. But where is the joy? And I also started to think to myself, this is a very fine line, because if I start to name the joy, and if I start to bring out the joy, am I minimizing the pain? Am I minimizing the trauma? And, I was having a discussion with a colleague today, and I was saying that I really believe that these dichotomies of joy and pain have been socially constructed, that we are taught from the very beginning that we're either working with the pain or we're either working with the joy, but we can't hold both at the same time. For some reason, that complexity is too much for us. And I'm using us as sort of a general. And so I really started to think about this. And I started to test it out a little. And I also started to think about myself. And I'm going to share a story now. And then after I share the story, because I've been talking a lot, I'm going to pull up the PowerPoint and I'm going to ask you a question in the place of self-reflection. And so I think I shared with you before. Some of you may have heard this story before, and I alluded to it in the beginning of my introduction, that when I was 6, I lost a brother to sudden infant death syndrome. He was 6 months old. I was 6. And from that moment on, my trajectory, my life experience really changed in many, many ways. Too much to go into right now. But I remember so just holding that for a second, right? And when my mom passed away 2 years ago, I was going through some pictures. And I found this old picture of me, and I was probably maybe 5. And it's this picture of this little girl, and she's wearing a rainbow shirt, and she has her hair in pigtails, and I have one tooth missing. And she's really happy. Do you ever look at a picture and you can almost feel the emotion through the picture? And I was holding that picture, and I said to myself in my head, or maybe out loud, I don't remember, I want to be that joyful again. I want that joy and that essence from that little girl to enter my life today. In all of the pain, in all of the trauma, in all of the racism and anti-Semitism and and destruction that's happening in this world today, I want to hold on to that joy while I continue to help people work through their challenges. And so I have that picture and I have it up on my desk and I look at it often and I started to really think about, that was my first experience of seeing myself be joyful. And despite all of my traumas, how do I bring that joy into my current life and hold it? Because I think that I need that joy to work through the pain and struggle and to help others work through that pain and struggle. And so these were the origins of me writing this book on trauma-informed spaces of liberation and joy. And so, I want to ask you a question, and I'm going to pull this up for a second. As social workers, we have many responsibilities, right? And oftentimes those responsibilities can be incredibly overwhelming. We are an under-resourced field that tends to be deficit focused. We have secondary adversities as it relates to trauma, and we hold a lot of pain. That said, I'm not using the word but, I'm using the word and. That said, what is our responsibilities as social workers to help our clients and our consumers and our students find joy and liberation in their world? What is our responsibility to do that? Do we have a responsibility to do that? And is this responsibility of helping find joy a radical shift in our profession? And are we able to do that? Remember, I said before, I think these dichotomies of joy and pain have been socially constructed. I also think that traditional social work has not taught us to use ourselves, has not taught us to bring emotionality into the therapeutic alliance, has set these ways of being that actually cause disconnection to our clients rather than deeper engagement. And I am offering that through the work of joy, through your personal work of joy, and through the work of our joy collectively as social workers, that we can start to deepen that alliance and help heal in ways that we may not have thought of before. And so I'm going to pause for a minute because I know I just talked for a lot and I said a lot and I shared some stories that may have also brought up points of activation for people. So I just want to kind of name that and hold that for all of us for a second. And I want you to also think about, what is your earliest memory of joy within your life? I have these reflection questions for us that we can think about. We don't have to do necessarily breakout rooms because this isn't a training, it's more just of a chat. But if you have a notebook or if you have a piece of paper or if you have a phone or if you want to use the chat, I'd like for you to just sit in this space with me and with us together. And I'd like for you to recall the earliest memory of joy within your home. Was it constant? Was it consistent? What did it look like? What did it feel like? What parts of this joy and our home life are we carrying with us? Are we clinging to? Are we passing on and letting go? So if we could just do this for about, 3 minutes, just a moment of kind of reflection on all that I said, and then I'll open it up to a space of dialogue. But I would just like for us to answer these questions in this moment. And then I'd love to hear what you're thinking and feeling. And please feel free to take a picture of these questions. You can use them for yourself. You can use them for your community. You can use them for your clients or supervisees. Both, what is our responsibility as social workers to engage clients and consumers in joy? and these questions too. They're for you to have. So about one more minute and then I'll stop this screen share, and I'd love for some thoughts or reflections. So feel free to open up your mics or unmute or put in the chat. I'd love to hear some voices. There's not that many of us, so we can, share space. What came up for you? If you want to share the responses to your questions, if you want to share, what you're thinking or feeling, I'd love to hear that. And I just want to, before we even do that, Amanda says in here that it builds off of the strength perspective. And yes, it absolutely does. I want to say that I think it goes deeper than the strength perspective, because I think we could say, I think we use these perspectives and intervention language a lot. And I want us to really unpack this word joy and this word liberation, and really think about when you say strength perspective, what are we actually talking about and how are we using ourselves to support that? So I'd love to hear from folks. Anyone? Anne, please. Thank you. Oh, you're muted, Anne.
There we go. Thanks everyone. The first thing that came into my head was the strengths perspective, but I went back to your other questions, and I, in my home, there was more complications. It wasn't, I didn't grow up in a very safe family, which is whatever. It is what it is. But what drew me to when I came into the field I'm getting old, right? So I was started in the 90s when the strengths perspective was new. Yeah. It was a paradigm shift in our field. And so that piece, along with my real focus on solution focused therapy. So what those pieces did for me with my background is it really allowed me to notice, and I worked in child welfare all these millions of years. And I remember families where, if I could focus on this strengths and these solutions and these, non-pathological kinds of things, that they would relax, they would smile. I remember this woman with 6 children who she was looking at her children and smiling at them. And then I was able to work with the smiling and then the joy. So for me, there is a real connection with that. The piece that was so important was really noticing this woman was, before I got there, she had her head in the oven to try to kill herself, right? So for her to work, for us to engage in a way with all the kids all over the place, this was all home-based work, and for her to smile and sigh and relax because her little 3-year-old was saying something really funny, right? And so then we were able to really focus on that piece. So there is a real connection for me with that, but it definitely starts with that piece about intentionally looking at what is going well, what brings this person joy, what do they love. I did a lot of video work with families about what is special, what do you love about your family? And these are all families in the child welfare system. So complicated, right? We all know these, the work that we do, but that piece about kind of moving in that direction of what feeds you more, I find is very powerful.
Yeah, absolutely. And being able to hold on to that in the midst of it all, and being able to use ourselves as models of when it's hard to hold that complexity of joy and pain, but yet we still do that, right? Like that use of self, that modeling. Thank you, Anne. Thank you.
Thank you.
Other people. Nicole, go ahead.
Hi, love this conversation. Yeah, so also as someone who's kind of entering the field later on in life,
Mhm.
you know, what you're speaking to, when I hear you speak to joy in the way that you are, I'm thinking of, again, without sort of trying to I'm thinking spirituality,
Absolutely.
but I
Yes.
don't want, I'm not spirituality like foo-foo spirituality,
Yeah.
but, you know, I'm thinking like we have to kind of meet the
Yeah.
resistance in order to get to that beautiful, divine, sacred, wonderful, beautiful, lovely self that is there already. So that, to me, the joy and the liberation is there. We just have
Yeah.
to, we have to wade through the muck. And how do we do that?
Yes.
So that's
And
kind of, yeah. So it feels like resistance, a lot of the trauma, right?
yes. And how do we do that personally? If we're not doing it personally, we're
Yes.
not going to be able to assist the other. And what I find, especially with my students, is that there's a block to going there for fear, for whatever those reasons are, right? That we have to do that work first in order to help. And I love that you use the word divine. And I'm going to read from a book in a little while that speaks to that also. So thank you for bringing that into the conversation. Latasha.
Thank you so much, Dr. Quiros.
Thank you
This
for
is a
being here.
wonderful topic already. I'm excited. I have to say that my reactions to your questions, I was like caught in the throat a little bit. Because, similar to what many folks have said, like my experience in my home was not consistently joyful. It was filled with a lot of challenge. Um, and I am now coming to the place just now, like in my own journey of like liberation. And I know that means something different for everyone, but recognizing that, oh, I need more joy, like my
Mhm.
own realization and working towards that. And realizing that I can only go so far with clients. Like I'm really good at unpacking and processing the trauma, as we like to say. But there is a block, in really thinking about joy. My reactions, recently to that, to the joy conversation has been this dichotomy of, well, what
Yeah.
about the trauma? We
Yeah.
can't forget about the trauma. And that has been my leaning, probably influenced by my own personal experience. So now
Mm,
at the place of recognizing, oh, this is yet another opportunity for me to do my own work around this in order to be available for clients. So I'm going to take these questions and continue to think about them, because
thank
I haven't centered those questions so far for myself. So thank you for offering them.
Thank you for sharing, and thank you for taking the questions and going deeper on them. I think, Deb, what you wrote in the chat is something that I just shared earlier with Nellie before we got on the call. And you know, being in spaces like higher education, for one example, for myself, that are very like grounded in sort of a white ideology that seems very normative to everyone else except for those that it doesn't. And how do I exist in those spaces and find my joy in those spaces, knowing that those spaces are still not healthy spaces, right? So it's not a linear path, it's not an easier path. I think our context influences that a lot, right? Like it's not a stagnant process. It's like I spend a lot of time before and after meetings in like quiet meditation, trying to sort of figure out like, how am I entering the space? How do I find joy in the space? Where am I activated? Right. So and I said this, both Latasha's a friend and colleague, and we were on the phone earlier. And I also said this to Nellie, that I think social work is one of the hardest fields, because when we do it right, it requires whole self that is constantly reflecting, that is constantly disrupting, that is constantly interrogating, that is constantly thinking about the person in the environment. That's exhausting and beautiful, and just like what we need to be able to find those places and spaces of joy. I'd love to hear from some other folks, even just what you're thinking, what you're holding. Asher, thank you.
Hi, and just thank you for providing this space and this opportunity, because you had me stumped. I
On
was
what?
like, the question of
Oh,
your joy, you want to talk to the clients about joy, but then it's like, as you reflect on your own life, it's like, wow, if I don't get this right for me, like, how could I get
Yes.
client to that place? So you had me stumped, and I am a new social worker. Just recently got licensed, but I work in child welfare.
Mm,
And this is something that, I kind of strive for with my clients, because, it's the trauma for the parents, and it's also the trauma for the children. So yeah, I just wanted to say thank you, because now you're adding to my purpose.
oh,
I want to
thank
say
you
thank you.
for
Yeah.
that. Yeah, thank you for that. Cindy, it's so nice to see you. Thank you for joining. Oh, you're on
I
mute.
could,
Oh, there you go.
oh,
Okay.
yeah, I was driving earlier, so that's why I wasn't on camera. But this is such a breath of fresh air. When I saw the notice for today, I teach a lot about joy, and for me, like, everything you said resonated with me so much, because I've been in the field 25 years, worked in so many different capacities, and now I find myself doing work to support people around thriving. And so
Mm,
I talk about joy all the time.
mm-hmm,
And my business partner, she says I have a resting joy face.
mm.
And the truth is,
You
I
do.
did
I
experience
agree with that. I agree.
and I did experience a lot of joy in my childhood, and I loved when you asked that question. I just started to laugh, and my smile was just so big that, when I smile broadly, I can't see, and I'm driving smiling. So I really appreciated that, because there's just so much going on in the world, and pulling from our moments of joy. And I'm not saying my childhood was perfect. It was not. There was definitely a lot of things that didn't go well. And there's just so much more that went well and that continued to go well. And, I was able to disrupt, patterns and cycles and things. So I really appreciate this conversation. I teach social work students, and I'm always talking about, using yourself in the
Mm-hmm,
work.
mm-hmm.
And it's a struggle, because I know a lot of people in the field for a long time that don't use themselves, and they struggle with this conversation of joy. So I love that we're talking about liberation, that we're
Yeah.
talking about joy, because that's where we need to start focusing our energy,
Mm-hmm.
because this work is exhausting, and it also could be exciting, innovative, and exhilarating. And so thank you so much for this conversation.
Thank you for entering and for sharing. Yeah, and you just reminded me that it's an action too. It's a state of being, it's an action. And I think, I always say the work of social justice doesn't just live in my professional space, but it's in my community, it's in my home. And so is my work of joy, being able to create that in my home as well, like actively, is not easy all the time. Right. And so, especially if you didn't especially if you didn't have models growing up of what joy was, right? And that being sort of a continued state. So I'd like to read. So Nicole kind of hit it on the head. I've been like trying to really think about my purpose in terms of somebody that I some of you may have said this before, I've heard me say this before, but I sort of think that social workers, at least for me, are restorers of the soul. That I think sometimes our soul gets impacted by all of the trauma, and I wanna work with people and students to restore the soul to a place where it was before the trauma impacted it. And I know that's really difficult in the world that we live in. But I've been thinking, I think a lot about purpose. And so I have this book, it's called The Amen Effect, and it's actually by a rabbi. Her name is Sharon Brous, and she talks about a lot of things in here. And I can put it in the chat after, but I picked it up because I do a lot of work around belonging, and there's a lot here on what it means to show up and what it means to belong. It's not a religious text at all, it's a human text. And so I thought I'd pull out just some passages for tonight, and I'd like to read them to you. And so the first one is that it's about purpose. And she says that imagine that the world is waiting for each of us to hear the call. to show up in precisely the way we are needed, to plant the seed of hope and possibility in the darkest of moments. So I'll read it again. And I want you to imagine this for yourself. Imagine that the world is waiting for each of us to hear the call, to show up in precisely the way we are needed, to plant the seeds of hope and possibility in the darkest of moments. And that's our purpose as social workers, I believe, right? And in order to do that, we have to get in touch with who we are. And there's this other chapter in here called Bear Witness, like the word witness. So she writes witness. And it's a quote by Sojourner Truth. And it says, life is a hard battle anyway. If we laugh and sing a little as we fight the good fight of freedom, it makes it all go easier. I will not allow my life's light to be determined by the darkness around me. I'll read it again. Life is a hard battle anyway. If we laugh and sing a little as we fight the good fight of freedom, it makes it all go easier. I will not allow my life's light to be determined by the darkness around me. So, just, curious your thoughts on that. Anything that came up for you while I was reading that? Anything that you're thinking about now? Any questions you have? Opening up the space for anyone. So I'm not going to interpret the silence, but I'm going to ask if there is does anyone feel challenged by this? Does this feel like a shift in practice? Does this feel like work you need to do? We're all here together, and I want this to be somewhat transformative, even the short time that we're here. So I'd love to even just hear some thoughts, like even if it's just, I'm thinking about such and such, I am inspired by this, I'm struggling with this, I do this anyway. Amanda said the first passage I read, she found herself smiling and nodding. Lee, go ahead.
Hi, sorry, I'm on my
Hi.
phone and I'm usually on my computer, so I apologize. I'm very awkward right now with the Zoom. But I'm a social work educator at Stony Brook, and I feel like these conversations are so layered because, I think about like our individual work, in teaching students how to work with people individually and how critical it is to, look at all of the strengths. And we really come from such a deficit model all the time. And our systems operate on such a deficit model that like, we're not supposed to feel joy. We're not supposed to find joy. We're not supposed to identify or talk about joy because it has no place in like a medical kind of like system. And I feel like it's really challenging to learn how to like teach social work students how to be what they might think is like a good social worker, where they're going to be able to be like employable, and they're going to be able to work with individual people, but then also they can really disrupt the systems that create this like lack of joy, because I think about like our capitalist system and like it doesn't go like a lot of these things, just there's a lot of like dissonance. And I just and I feel like it's really exciting to be in these conversations because I think that the conversations create some of the transformation. So it was really great listening to everyone respond already and to hear about the work you're doing, because I just think that as social workers, like the quotes that you read, that's where we should be really, is like, we bear witness, we also make change, we have to be subversive a lot of times within these systems. And it's just really challenging. And so I just appreciate everything. I feel like now I'm just rambling. So thank you.
No, thank you. And I wonder what would happen if you gave your students those questions, what would come up for them? Like, what if you just gave them the question and said, I'm just going to answer these questions today. I think I know with my students, they're so wedded to interventions and diagnoses and oftentimes unable to use themselves as models of practice, right? Like And so I want to encourage, that's why I asked all of you those questions in terms of where you experienced joy the first time and what it was like for you growing up with or without joy, because those are, you can use your experiences as a use of self to model how to do that with clients. So Patricia says, I struggle with giving my joy and trying align with my client while trying to replenish it after long, hard hours and dealing with crisis, politics at home, challenging clients, and can't see. Nellie, do you mind reading that? I can't see the rest of the, oh, I see. Challenging clients in my own personal life. Yeah. Sorry. Yeah. And it is challenging work. And I think that's what Latasha was talking about before in terms of this, it's so hard. And also, how do you bring in the joy without minimizing all of the hard and challenging things that are going on? I think that we are in deep need of healing as a profession, as a society. And this is one way to kind of shift that paradigm to do that. Anne, please go ahead.
It also makes me very much think about the environments in the agencies that we work.
Yeah.
That so often, the work is so demanding and the caseloads are high, the work is demanding. The support should be there, and sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. And so for me, I just had such an incredibly difficult experience at an agency where my friends were talking to me about finding joy. You've got to find joy in this work and because the stress is just bad. It's not okay to live in that stress all the time. So so my only little piece with this is that it's where my space that I'm in as I listen to this is more of what is the agency context and what is the culture and the context of the agency and the support the brilliance of all these social workers that are out there doing this work, and then knowing the pressures that is on everyone. So I think that the work with families and individuals and all that is just so sacred, but it's also this idea of what is the environment that we're working in and how do we really push that piece, this idea about caring for, self-care and joy and feeding ourselves so that we can do this work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes that's almost impossible to do. And so, my kind of answer to that is like, where do we find our influence, right? Like for me, it's in the classroom. That's my sacred space. That's the place. Once I leave the classroom, I have no control, right? But in the classroom, that's my space. In my home, that's my space. With my community, that's my space. And so I've really become intentional about acceptance, not submissiveness, but acceptance. And I've practiced it through meditation because I've had to, right? Like, this is the world, this is the environment. How am I going to still exist and carry that light and find that joy while also living in incredibly oppressive spaces, right? That I can do both. I can find, and it's not easy, but it requires a sense of, spiritual presence and acceptance and being, which is the other thing is that I don't think in generalist practice courses in general or in supervisory sessions, we're sitting with our students, teaching them how to meditate and be in places of presence. Like we should be doing that, right? Like, because this work requires a level of intentionality, acceptance, awareness, and presence that is incredible, right? And I don't know if we do a great job of teaching that because it's not in the curriculum or it's not in the traditional supervisory courses. But I want to change that, right? And I want us as a collective to be able to change that too. Other people? Remember, this is just a chat. The book will be done, probably it'll come out like fall, and maybe we'll do another one with that. But in the meantime, I'm happy to engage with anyone around this work. But we still have time. So if there's other people that, want to share anything around this, please do. Or even while you join tonight, quiet space. Deb, go ahead.
Hi there.
Hi.
You mentioned acceptance. I'm a fourth year student, BSW student in technically in Victoria, Canada. And I've been reflecting on, like you mentioned, acceptance. And I've been reflecting on the practice of radical acceptance. And I could see that as being a precursor to help when working with people, as you know, how to be in the oppressive space and to be actively oppressed even by the people that are helping you.
Yeah.
And find some space for joy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I must admit, when I first read the little blurb, you know, before I joined tonight,
Yeah.
and I saw, you know, about trauma as an opportunity, I was just like, oh, you know, like, I don't know. It needs a lot of context.
Yeah. Oh, yes.
So that so that trauma is never, like, so that someone's not sitting there at the wrong time kind of trying to get someone to connect with joy. You know?
And it needs context, and it also needs training, because it could easily be like, oh, don't, minimization. It's like, let's find the opportunity. Let's bring in joy. That's not what I'm saying at all. I'm so glad you named that. My colleague and I had that discussion. She's like, well, like, you have to be so careful. And yes, that's why this pre-work of intentionality and use of self and understanding who you are needs to come first, or else you're just minimizing people's trauma, right? Like, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. And good luck.
So, one of the reasons, that I selected to join tonight was just the idea. You said spaces. I automatically think about, I work in child welfare, so trauma comes up, a lot. And people feel, burnt out,
Yes.
in doing the work. And I felt like maybe if I connect here, I could figure out what are we doing wrong, or what other lens can we look at the trauma that is not going to be in such a way that, we're trying to be somebody's savior, what that causes us to feel, these burnt out feelings. So I was actually hoping for my own opportunity, to learn, something new and something different, and which I did. As I said, that this whole topic of, the joy has challenged me, because now I'm thinking, if I have my joy, then it's going to be easier, to transcend that off onto the families that I'm working with the individual clients. If I have my own joy, then where is burnout coming from? Because I have a joy in doing what it is that I'm doing. So where's the burnout? So I mean, I'm grateful.
I'm grateful that you joined. And, a few of you mentioned you're in child welfare, an incredibly challenging, oppressive systems in so many ways. And so I actually think it's so important, walking that fine line, as Deb and I were just talking about, to help those families, even in the circumstances that they're in, connect to that place of joy and hope, right? That will help them rebuild and and live, right, in a place that's not deficit focused. And that's so hard. It's so hard, and you don't have really many models to look to for that. But there is community. And I want to also bring your attention to the work of Barbara Love, who does work around liberation and joy too. She's wonderful. Barbara Love is her name. It's ironic, but not, because she's lovely and her work is incredible. So there is some work that she has done too in the space. So I encourage you, I'll put it in the chat, Barbara Love. And I am going to continue to do this work. And I know my colleagues are also going to step into this space and do this work with me in articles and chapters that we're writing. And so before we kind of intentionally close tonight, is there anything else that anybody's holding or anything that anyone wants to bring into this space? So,
hello, good evening.
Julie, go ahead, Julie.
Sorry, I couldn't find the
That's
functions to
okay.
raise it. Thank you for the opportunity. For
Thank
me, I made the connection with the slide. Also in my own experience, but also in my own, for me, joy is a part of my like self-care practice, to call it like that, and we have to put that label. For me, it was shocking as a student at that point when that was included in one of the revisions, during the pandemic in the NASW code of ethics. For me, it was shocking. It was like, this is not here? I mean, maybe is it assumed that everybody does it? But for me, I did that reflection. I'm like, I mean, I do it, but I hope that others do it. But for me, that was something but I'm glad it is there, explicit. But I did the connection between the word, the concept of joy and my own self-care practice. But something that I did the connection also is with to observe children. For me, they model and we can learn from them. It's part of the care, to observe in their simplicity, their nature, and how do they express. So I model that, I learn from that, and I use it as my own practice. Like you mentioned music in one of the quotes, and I don't remember what else, but I remember the music. So I would add to that, like play.
Yeah, I love that you named children in that. I have two daughters, as I mentioned, and the older one is probably a mini me, just a world of angst and anxiety and like high performing and all sorts of things. And my little one, I call her my heart because she's just like, sometimes I don't even recognize her because she has such an open heart and she just loves life, and she has this empathy and acceptance. And when you name children, Julie, I just started to think of her image came into my mind because it's amazing to see children who are joyful and who can play and to see things and feel things and notice things about you that you don't even notice. So thank you for bringing that in. Josefina?
Hi, thank you so much. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, so I think the joy is individually based and individually defined. I think that we've talked about a lot of things like accept that, or maybe we just touched on it a little bit. I feel like joy needs to be permanent. Like one of the reasons I did a shift in my responsibilities after 26 years in outpatient mental health. My first job was in a domestic violence shelter, and I worked with the book A Battered Woman. I don't know if you remember that book. That was like my very first book. And then with Vanderkolk, we did some trauma work, and then STARE, and then I did some CPP, child parent psychotherapy, trauma focused cognitive behavioral therapy. And I was feeling like most of us come from, we know the stories, we have similar stories, right? We're like what they say, wounded healers, but some of us come in as wounded warriors. We're still fighting. Some of us are still in some kind of situations that don't bring us joy. So we have to shift that so that joy becomes something permanent and so that it can become sustainable. So that the person on the other end, whatever you want to call them, child, client, patient, is not relying on you to put in something. So we have to be able to access it and make it permanent for ourselves so that we can sell it. We can't sell what we don't have and what we can't buy. And I used to ask myself my last few weeks at work, my last few years really, how much joy did I get today? Making it intentional to see at the end of the day, not at the end of the week, because by Friday I will be fried crisp. I didn't want another phone call. And sometimes I'll be on call over the weekend, or I will get a phone call on Saturdays. So, how much joy is this still bringing me, and what can I control? Because if I'm going to get paid, let's say $200, but I have to spend $250 to go to the spa so that I can feel joy, that's not, the balance is off.
True.
I'm kind of speaking to what you said at the beginning about, the underpayment, the being overwhelmed, but we all have the responsibility we owe that to ourselves and to our clients to kind of look at everything and keep an eye on that balance to make sure it doesn't shift too much. And when the day comes, we may need to move in order to find joy. We'll still be social workers, we'll still be therapists, but being in the same place could also make you feel very helpless and very bitter.
Totally. And you also reminded me of language. Like, I've heard that phrase before, wounded healer, but I actually don't think I'm wounded. Do you know what I mean? Like, I had this discussion with a friend of mine. I was like, well, I'm not like wounded according to who, right? Like, I just happen to live in a space of trauma, and I was wounded, but I am not wounded. Do you know what I mean? Like, when we talk about children at risk, they're not at risk. Their environment makes them not. Their environment is the place that's at risk, right? So, like, I think also as social workers, we take on language sometimes without thinking about how it can be reframed. So that's why I say restorers of the soul, or healers, right? Like, because I also think, like, I think Deb put it in the chat before, like, being careful that we're not living in this sort of like oppressive system, and we're further oppressing ourselves by using language that is deficit focused, right? So, survivor versus victim, for example. So I think, like, I always tell my students, like, pay attention to the language that you're using, like, unpack it, pay attention to it, make sure you're not just adopting language from the DSM or from organizational culture, because organizations, especially those in child welfare, there's so many labels that are just incorrect, right? That don't understand, that just label without context. And so yeah, I'm big on language too. But yeah, thank you so much for all of that and for participating. So we're about time. This could have turned into a whole workshop with lots of fun dialogues and breakout groups. So maybe we'll do that again. You can ask Nellie if we can do that. Another CE credit. We'll do that. But I just want to thank you. Like, I don't know most of you here, and I'm really happy that you entered my orbit tonight, and that I hope there was something that you took away, and I hope that you are able to claim and name your joy. And as Josefina said, that it becomes permanent in your life and evolving amidst all of the pain and suffering. And just sending love and healing and acceptance to all of you. And thank you so much. I hope you leave this and have something to eat or something to drink that makes you feel good, or take a walk, or do something that kind of brings joy into your day or night to night, depending on where you're calling from. So Nellie, thank you and your team so much. And thank you all for sharing space with me.
Thank you, Laura.
Thanks, Carol. Nice to see you.
I have a voice.
Yes.
I don't have a camera at the moment, but here I am. But this was really enlightening and really inspiring. So
thank you
so much.
All right, everyone. Take care. Be well.
Bye.